Welcome to Greatest Companies. I'm your host. This is the story of a company whose stock fell 94%, took 10 years just to get back to even, and proved one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of investing, that being completely right is not nearly enough. Let me start in the spring of 2001, with a man sitting down to write a letter. His name is Jeff Bezos. His company, Amazon, is in free fall. And he begins his annual letter to shareholders with a single word: ouch. It had been, he wrote, a brutal year for the markets, and certainly for Amazon's shareholders. The stock was down more than 80% from the year before, and 80% didn't even capture it, because from the peak in December 1999 to the bottom in late 2001, Amazon shares didn't fall 80%. They fell about 94%. From roughly $107 all the way down to about $6. But then, having written ouch, Bezos did something that tells you why Amazon is a legend and most of its peers are forgotten. He reached past the wreckage of the stock price and reminded his shareholders of an old idea from Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing. In the short run, Graham said, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, it is a weighing machine. There had been, Bezos wrote, an awful lot of voting in the boom of 1999, and very little weighing. He was sitting in the bottom of a 94% collapse, telling his shareholders to ignore the vote and wait for the weigh-in. And he was right. But it would take roughly 10 years for that scale to balance, and almost nobody had the stomach to wait. That gap between being right and surviving being right is what this whole episode is about. To understand it, let's go back to a world that no longer exists. The world before Amazon. Before Amazon, retail had one hard physical limit. A store was a place, and a place could only hold so much. The biggest bookstore in your city might carry 100,000 titles. That felt like infinity, right up until you wanted the 100,001st. Shelf space was finite. It was expensive. It was local. What a store could sell was capped by the floor space it could rent and the inventory it could afford to let sit there. Selection was a luxury. Convenience was a fantasy. And nobody thought of this as a problem because it was just how the physical world worked. And then, in the mid-1990s, a former Wall Street analyst noticed that one corner of the world was about to stop being physical. Jeff Bezos, in 1994, had a very comfortable, very prestigious job at a New York hedge fund, the kind of career most people would be terrified to walk away from. And then he came across one statistic that lodged in his brain and would not leave. The World Wide Web was growing at something like 2,000% a year. Almost nothing in the physical economy grows that fast. Bezos thought, a business built to ride that wave could become enormous. So he made a list of things you could sell online, and he chose books. And his reasoning was pure, cold logic. There were millions of book titles in print, far more than any physical store could ever stock. So an online store could offer a selection no physical rival could touch. And a book is a commodity. A given title is identical everywhere, so people would trust buying one without holding it first. Now, the way Bezos actually decided to quit his job has become famous because it became the philosophy of the entire company. He ran what he called a regret minimization framework. He imagined himself at 80 years old, looking back, and asked, which would I regret more? Trying to build something on the internet and failing, or never having tried at all? Put that way, the answer was obvious. He and his wife got in a car and drove across the country to Seattle, and he wrote the business plan in the passenger seat on the way. And here's the trait that matters most about Bezos, the one that explains both the 94% crash and the recovery from it. He had an almost total indifference to the short term in service of the long term. He told shareholders over and over that he was willing to be misunderstood for long stretches of time. And he meant it. He was building a machine to turn today's profit into tomorrow's scale. And a market that wanted profit today was going to hate that machine for years before it finally understood it. Amazon opened to the public in 1995, selling books out of a garage in Seattle. It grew at exactly the violent pace Bezos had bet on. It went public in 1997. And as the dot-com mania built toward its peak, Amazon became one of its brightest stars, growing explosively, expanding from books into music, videos, electronics, toys. By December 1999, the stock was near $107, and the company was worth about $30 billion. And it had never made a single dollar of profit. That's the fact the skeptics seized on. And as the bubble started to wobble, the attacks turned vicious. In 1999, the financial magazine Barron's ran a famous cover with a one-word headline, Amazon.bomb. The next spring, it ran another piece, titled Burning Up, reporting that despite its massive valuation, Amazon had only about 10 months of cash left and was burning through it fast. And here's the thing. The skeptics were not being stupid. Amazon was burning cash. It had never turned a profit. And all around it, companies exactly like it were dying. Pets.com, Webvan, Cosmo, some of which Amazon had personally invested in. On paper, Amazon looked like the next domino to fall. What saved it wasn't just luck, though luck played its part. It was a decision made on the balance sheet, at the very top of the market. In early 1999, Amazon's first chief financial officer, a woman named Joy Covey, led a convertible bond offering that raised about $1.25 billion, more than twice what the company had originally planned to raise. And that deal closed roughly a month before the bubble began to burst. Think about the timing of that. Capital raised at the moment of maximum optimism, at peak valuation, just before the window slammed shut. That money became the runway that carried Amazon through the years of darkness, while its competitors, the ones who hadn't raised when they had the chance, simply ran out of cash and died. I want to pause on Joy Covey for a moment, because hers is a quiet and essential, and in the end, a tragic part of this story. She was a brilliant financial mind. She engineered the financing that arguably saved the company, and then she left to pursue other passions in her life. She died in 2013, struck by a vehicle while she was cycling. The survival of the everything store rests, in no small part, on one perfectly timed decision she made at the very peak of the boom. And now we come to the fact that should be taught in every investing class in the world, and almost never is. From its all-time high in December 1999 to its low in late 2001, Amazon's stock fell about 94%. And then it took roughly a decade, all the way to late 2009, just to climb back to that 1999 peak. I need you to really sit with this one, because it contains the single most important lesson in this entire series. You could have been completely, perfectly, historically right. You could have looked at the entire universe of internet stocks in 1999, every single one, and picked the one company that would go on to reshape global commerce, build the biggest cloud computing business on the planet, and become one of the most valuable companies in human history. You could have picked Amazon, the single best pick available. And picking the best company of the entire era would still not have saved you from a 94% drawdown and a 10-year wait just to break even. This shatters the comfortable little story most investors tell themselves. The story goes, if only I'm smart enough to spot the great company early, everything else will take care of itself. No, it will not. Spotting the right company was the easy part. Surviving the consequences of being right was the part that almost nobody managed. That 10-year round trip back to zero shook out everyone except the most ironclad holders on Earth. And it did it while Amazon, the actual business, got stronger every single year. Because here's what had happened. The stock and the company had completely divorced from each other. The voting machine was screaming that Amazon was dying. But the weighing machine, if anyone had bothered to look, showed the opposite. Customer numbers climbing from 14 million to 20 million. Sales nearly doubling. Losses narrowing. Bezos pointed at exactly those numbers in his ouch letter. The company, he said, was in a stronger position than at any time in its history. And he was telling the truth. The stock did not care. And it would not care for years. So what did everyone get wrong? 3 things, and each one is a lesson that never goes out of date. The first mistake, confusing the stock price with the company. From 1999 to 2001, the stock fell 94%, while the business grew its customers, its sales, and its competitive position every single year. The price was measuring fear. The company was compounding underneath. For years, the two had almost nothing to do with each other. The second mistake, reading "never made a profit" as "can't make a profit." But Amazon wasn't failing to make a profit. It was choosing not to. On purpose. It was pouring every available dollar back into lower prices, wider selection, faster delivery. Deliberately starving its own income statement to feed its moat. The market looked at a company that couldn't earn money. It was actually looking at a company that refused to, as a strategy. And the third mistake, assuming the everything store was just a risky online retailer. Because the scale Amazon built to sell books, cheaply, quietly, became something else. It became infrastructure. And infrastructure can be rented out. The exact same logic that produced low prices on books would, a few years later, produce Amazon Web Services. The skeptics were pricing a bookstore. They could not see the utility company hiding inside it. The recovery, when it came, did not come from the bookstore. It came, the way it so often does in these stories, from a founder who refused to let the company stay only what it currently was. In the years right after the crash, while the stock was still deep underwater, Amazon launched the 3 things that would define its entire second act. In 2005, Amazon Prime, which turned occasional shoppers into members who, having paid for fast shipping, suddenly bought far more of everything. In 2007, the Kindle, which began Amazon's move into devices and digital media. And in 2006, almost as a side effect of the enormous computing power Amazon had built just to run its own store, it launched Amazon Web Services and quietly lit the fuse on what would become a trillion-dollar business. AWS is the purest distillation of the whole Amazon idea. The company had built vast, reliable computing capacity for itself, and Bezos realized that this capacity, like everything else Amazon built at scale, could be rented out to others at a low price, and that being first and cheapest, at enormous scale, would create a lead almost nobody could ever close. By the middle of the 2020s, AWS was the biggest cloud provider on Earth. And here's the kicker. Even though it was only about 1/6 of Amazon's revenue, it generated the majority of the company's profit. The bookstore had become the backbone of the internet. Let's talk about the moat, because Amazon's scale itself turned into a weapon. Bezos understood something most retailers were afraid of. In a business of thin margins, the lowest cost operator wins. And scale is what produces the lowest cost. So he built a flywheel. Lower prices bring in more customers. More customers attract more sellers onto the platform. More sellers bring more selection. More selection and more traffic justify building more warehouses and faster delivery, which drives down the cost per item, which funds even lower prices. And around it goes. Each turn of that wheel makes the next turn easier and makes it harder and harder for any competitor without Amazon's scale to match its prices without bleeding money. Then, Amazon stacked a second moat on top. Prime is a lock-in. Once you're paying for membership, getting fast free delivery plus video and music, leaving for arrival means paying twice and getting less. And AWS is a third moat, the biggest, cheapest, most deeply entrenched cloud infrastructure in the world, with switching costs that only grow the more a customer builds on it. Scale and cost at the foundation. Ecosystem lock-in on top. Amazon might be the most complete example of that pattern anywhere in this series. So let me make it personal, the way I always do. Imagine you'd put $10,000 into Amazon at its peak in December 1999. The worst possible moment. But you'd done the impossible. You'd correctly picked the defining company of the age. By late 2001, your stake would be worth about $600. You'd have read Barron's calling your company a bomb. You'd have watched its rivals go bankrupt one by one. And you'd have waited. Not 1 year, not 2, but until late 2009, a full decade, just to get your $10,000 back. And only then would the real compounding even begin. If you had endured every bit of that and held, you would have ridden Amazon from a $30 billion company to one worth, by early 2026, around $2.2 trillion. One of the most valuable enterprises on the planet. The return from that bottom is one of the great wealth stories in all of market history. But the math carries the same merciless message as every story in this series. The return was historic, and it was available only to the investor who could survive a 94% crash and a 10-year wait to break even, without flinching, holding a company the financial press had already declared dead. Almost no one did. That isn't a footnote to the story. That is the story. Now picture the other timeline, the one where Joy Covey doesn't push that $1.25 billion bond deal through in early 1999, or pushes a smaller one, or closes it a few months later after the window has slammed shut. Amazon walks into the dot-com crash with a fraction of the cash it actually had. The burn continues, the markets freeze, and it cannot raise another dollar. Because by 2000 and 2001, nobody on earth is funding unprofitable internet retailers at any price, and somewhere in that long descent, the everything store runs out of money. Exactly like Pets.com. Exactly like Webvan. And it files for bankruptcy, just one more cautionary tale from the bubble. No Prime, no Kindle, and no Amazon Web Services, which means the entire cloud computing revolution arrives later, from someone else, in some other shape. It didn't happen that way, because a CFO raised money at the top when she could, instead of waiting until she had to. And because a founder treated a 94% drawdown as weather, not as a verdict. And the lesson there is not that Amazon was destined to win. It's that survival is engineered in advance, in the good times, by people disciplined enough to prepare for a storm that nobody else believes is coming. So what does Amazon really teach us? Let me give it to you in layers, from the surface down to the part that matters most. On the surface, it's about method. Build a flywheel, not a product. Bezos didn't chase one good idea. He built a self-reinforcing system, where every advantage funded the next one. The trader's version is a process that compounds its own edges, instead of a single setup that works right up until it doesn't. A layer down, it's about money. Raise capital when you can, not when you must, and keep enough in reserve to survive being right too early. Amazon lived because of money raised at the top, weeks before the crash. The investor's version is identical. Size your positions and hold enough reserve so that being early, which feels exactly like being wrong, never forces you to sell at the bottom. A layer deeper, it's about the mind. The stock price is not the company. Holding Amazon meant staring at a screen that called you a fool for 10 straight years, while the business underneath quietly thrived. That is the exact discipline a trader needs, to separate the noise of the price from the signal of the thesis, and to keep faith with the thesis when the price is unbearable. And then, at the very deepest level, Amazon leaves us with a question. Because Amazon proves that being right is the easy part, and surviving being right is the hard part. So the real question is not, can I find a great company? The real question is, can I arrange my life and my money so that I'm still standing and still holding on the far side of being right too early? Because the market will routinely make you wait a decade to be proven correct, and it will spend that entire decade trying to shake you loose. The edge was never just the insight. The edge was the capacity to endure the gap between the insight and the proof. Bezos endured it by reading his own letter, the one quoting Graham, by choosing every single day for 10 years to believe the weighing machine over the voting machine against the screaming of the price on the screen. That choice is the whole job. It always was. If this story stayed with you, the deepest version of it lives in the book and across the rest of this series, where we trace company after company through the long, dark middle between the moment failure looked certain and the moment success looked obvious. I'm your host. This has been Greatest Companies. Until next time, keep building.